Okay, we might get started. I'm sure there's still some people joining us online, but we'll get started. So welcome everyone to the School of Allied Health, Human Services and Sport Oration for 2025. My name is Jodie McCollins, so welcome to all of those who are joining. This oration is occurring in conjunction with the Living with Disability Research Seminar. The university acknowledges our campuses are located on the lands of many traditional custodians in Victoria and New South Wales. We recognise their ongoing connection to the land and value their unique contribution to the university and wider Australian society. La Trobe University is committed to providing opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, both as individuals and communities, through teaching, learning, research and partnerships across all our campuses. So as you all know, today's oration will be presented by Professor Chris Bigby. Chris is an esteemed member of La Trobe University's community and has been a member of La Trobe for several years now. Professor Bigby is the director of the Living with Disability Research Centre. She is a leading social work scholar in intellectual disability. Her work has led to organisational and cultural change in accommodation services and has informed evidence-based training that is widely used for direct support workers. Professor Bigby's research underpinned the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission's 2023 recommendations for new accommodation practice standards, which were endorsed by the Disability Royal Commission and the independent NDIS review. Professor Bigby led research to co-develop a group home culture scale and translated rights principles into a supported decision-making framework, which is now embedded in the practices of the Victorian TAC and the Queensland and Tasmanian Public Trustees. Professor Bigby has led 9 ARC and other competitive grants, been CI on many more, including over 100 industry projects. She supervised 18 PhD candidates, authored 10 books, 57 book chapters, and has published nearly 200 peer-reviewed manuscripts and 82 reports. Professor Bigby's impactful research has been recognised with many awards, including an Officer of the Order of Australia this year. Congratulations, Chris. The IASSIDD Distinguished Achievement Award in 2019, multiple Australasian Research Prizes, and the Bruce Lord Award in 2022, as well as the Manda Joyens Award in 2024. I'm sure that you will join me in looking forward to hearing from Professor Bigby in today's oration. Her title is Progress on Deinstitutionalisation and Community Living for All People with Intellectual Disabilities, the Significance of Good Support Practice. Just letting you know, there will be time at the end to ask questions of Chris, so we'll wait until then to put them into the chat, and I will be reading Chris the questions from the chat. So I'll hand over to Chris now.
So I want to just start by saying I don't do anything on my own, and that all of the things that I've done have been in collaboration with members of the Living with Disability Research Centre and with industry partners. And I'm going to today draw on research that we've done over quite a long period of time from our longitudinal study and from other studies. And people like Lincoln Humphreys do a lot of the analysis of this work, and people like Jelena and the other research assistants do a lot of data collection, and without them, none of this would be possible. So that's just a disclaimer. This isn't all my work. What I'm going to do today is, if anybody was in Belgium 2 weeks ago, then I'm going to essentially do a sort of rerun of a keynote that I did at a conference there, which was a large conference of European providers of intellectual disability services, particularly for people with high support needs and mental health issues. So I'm going to try and talk about very briefly the meaning of deinstitutionalisation, the outcomes that we've sought about deinstitutionalisation, why was it such an important policy issue, what progress have we made, and why have we made so little progress, and what's next? How might we think about this perhaps a little differently? And I started to think about these issues when I was involved in writing a chapter for Jan Tossebro's recent book about deinstitutionalisation in Scandinavia. He asked me to write a chapter that reflected on his reflections on 30 years of deinstitutionalisation in Scandinavia and how did that match up to what was happening in Australia. And it really made me realise the parallels between those two very different places and the common lack of progress, but the very different trajectories that we've been following. And the other thing I should say, that as I begin to write this, I realised that I was in fact adding on the next layer of analysis to a paper that Jim Mansell wrote in 2006 about the progress of deinstitutionalisation. And many of the things that he said at that time, which is now almost 20 years ago, he foreshadowed many of the things that are happening today. So I'm going to do a fairly high-level overview, and I've added references into the slides, and the references are at the end. The slides will be available, and you can follow up any of those bits that you want to. But the proposition basically is that the quality of support for people with intellectual disabilities in their everyday living situation, and for many that is people living in supported accommodation in small group homes, the quality of that support underpins all the other more specialist supports or interventions that they may also receive. And it influences the success of those other interventions and the overall quality of life for people with intellectual disabilities. So we often don't spend a lot of time talking about everyday quality of life and everyday support for people. We tend to get sidetracked into the more specialist types of interventions and the professionals there and the rules about that. And the evidence base around everyday support tends to get forgotten. So I think that's my proposition. Specialist things are really important, but they build upon an everyday foundation, which is delivered by direct support workers and organisations that are responsible for managing supported accommodation services in Australia and elsewhere. So if we go back to the 1970s, deinstitutionalisation has been a dominant policy aim for 30, 50 years now. And institutions were defined by place, by the practices that happened in them, and by the culture of those places and those practices. They were seen to be large places that segregated people from the rest of the community, that congregated people together, and that isolated people from the rest of the community. And they were often on the edges of towns and away from the mainstream of the population. And they were characterised by rigid routines, by block treatment of people, by depersonalisation, and a culture that was about social distance between staff and people that were living in the institutions, and of control by staff over people. So the aim of this policy was about closing institutions, but not only about closure, but also about developing community living service systems to replace institutions, but also to support people who'd never been in institutions, and to bring about broader community change. So this quote, which comes from Gallant in 1994, sort of sums that up and says, deinstitutionalisation is the process of supporting people on an individual basis, providing the tools necessary for them to create a presence and a life within the community. And importantly, the success or failure of deinstitutionalisation will rest on our ability to collectively to prepare our communities to accept persons with intellectual disabilities as valued and contributing members of society. So that is the way in which deinstitutionalisation was conceived right really from the beginning. It's about closure, community living systems, and social change. And it's interesting that the drivers of deinstitutionalisation have varied over time, and the significance of this, I think, will become clearer later on. But the early deinstitutionalisation was driven by an ideology of normalisation that was developed by Nuge and others in Denmark and the Scandinavian countries. And it was very specific around people with intellectual disabilities. It was about providing people with normal patterns of everyday life. And that was seen to be what should happen for people with intellectual disabilities. It was also driven, particularly in America, by some of the social justice concerns and the horrors of institutional care, and particularly the sort of photo book that was released by Burton Black in 1966 about what institutional care actually looked like and how awful it was. And interestingly, we still see some of those types of pictures that come from places in Eastern Europe. It was, if you read Jan Tossebro's book, he talks about the deinstitutionalisation driver in the Scandinavian countries as being very much about welfare reform, that there was a reform in the 80s about how the welfare system was organised in the Scandinavian countries, which focused on the decentralisation of services from central state control to municipalities. And his argument suggests that actually they weren't particularly, the reformers weren't particularly interested in intellectual disability services, but they got caught up with the decentralisation of hospitals and aged care. So it was really lucky that they got caught up in that, but that the issues about people with intellectual disabilities weren't the main driver. Some of the work that Ilan Wiesel led around deinstitutionalisation in Australia shows that urban regeneration programs were also very important in Australia about driving the closure of some institutions and the reshaping of some of our cities. And Stancliffe's work from America demonstrates clearly the driver around economics, that as institutions got smaller, it was much more economically sound to close them and to relocate people to smaller community-based services. And more recently, with the UN Convention, human rights for all people with disabilities has become a driver behind deinstitutionalisation. And importantly, that's very much a de-differentiated policy that's talking about all people with disabilities and not just focused on people with intellectual disabilities. So what are the outcomes? Why is deinstitutionalisation so important? So the dominant outcome has been the flip side of what was seen to be institutional life. And it was sort of captured in this term from Tao in 1988 of an ordinary life in the community. And this came from the UK. And he talked about people living in ordinary houses, in ordinary streets, being integrated into their local communities. So it was almost seen that people would just fit in if they were given the right living circumstances, the right type of house in the right place, they would be able to fit into the community. And that was what was being sought, integration. And the word is quite important. It was integration rather than inclusion. But since then, there's been some quite significant shifts in the sort of outcomes that we've been trying to achieve. I think the rights movement with the UN Convention sort of relabeled deinstitutionalisation in many ways in terms of the rights of all people with disabilities rather than just being the deinstitutionalisation sort of policy. And the rights agenda has placed much less emphasis on place and size. It's shifted that emphasis to one of choice and control. So if you read the UN Convention Article 19 and the General Comment in 2017, it talks about people living independently and being included in the community with choices equal to others, and that people should be supported the support should be based on choice for people to carry out their daily activities and to participate in the community. So there's a very different flavour. It's not so much about place, it's more about people having choice and control of where they live and how they live. And the UN Convention also draws attention to the fact that institutional practices and culture can occur in any place regardless of size. And this is a quote from the general comment, again, number 5. It says, it's not just about living in a particular building or setting. It's first and foremost about not losing personal choice and autonomy as a result of the imposition of a certain life and living arrangements. So we're losing the connection between place and size as it shifts over time to become much more about choice and control. There are some less powerful shifts and sort of countercurrents that have developed over time. And I guess the most important of these are the ones that have come from the geographers and from the political scientists. And they've challenged many of the normative ideas that were embedded in the idea of an ordinary life. That an ordinary life was about having a house, having a job, being independent, being self-determined. And they draw attention much more to the importance of people belonging, being known, being recognised by other people, and that people may belong to diverse communities. And it's not necessarily about fitting in to any one community, but it's about belonging and being part of any number of diverse communities that might exist. So there's that sort of countercurrent been happening at the same time as the rights agenda. So how far have we progressed with this idea about deinstitutionalisation? And I first of all want to look just at place and size. And we tend to think about this as community living versus institutional living. And when you look at the data across the world, it's quite surprising. There are countries where most institutions have closed and where small group homes dominate the provision of services and where there are some more individualised options. So Sweden, Australia, Norway and the US have closed all or the majority of their large institutions. Really only Sweden and Australia have managed to hold a line about small group homes. So the average of a group home size in Sweden is 5 people. In Australia, most of our group homes are less than 6. Some are quite significantly smaller. In Norway, they started with an average of 5 or 6, and it's grown over time. It's become the average of 9. And about 50% of people with intellectual disabilities now live in a group home, which is larger than 5 or 6 people and is 7+ people. And in the US, about 21% of people live in smaller services, but there's still 7 or more people. And importantly, there are some fundamental differences in the design. Group homes in Sweden, everybody has their own apartment bedsit and then the shared space. Whereas in Australia, we tend to have each person has their own bedroom, but they share more space. They share a kitchen, they share bathrooms, and they have shared living space. Whereas in Sweden, people have shared living space, but also their own living space and their own kitchen and their own bathrooms. But importantly, there are countries where large institutions are still the dominant form of service provision, where small group homes and more individualised living options are quite rare. So in most of Europe, they talk about having group homes, but they are larger than the 5 or 6 people in Sweden and Australia. So they're on average around 20, 30 people. And the dominant model across Europe is residential services with 30+ people living in the same building or on the same site. And services where they're smaller with 6 or fewer people are really quite rare. Although there's a lot of variability within countries and between countries, but in general, larger services still dominate the landscape. And that's also the case in our part of the world, in Hong Kong, in Singapore and Taiwan. So in terms of achievement, in terms of place or size, we haven't really got very far if you look at it in an international context. So where have we got then in terms of quality of life for people who have moved out of institutions and are living in small group homes in the community. There's a wealth of research that says undoubtedly that living in the community is preferable, is better, you have a better quality of life than living in an institution. And that research was done in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, where it compared old institutions with new group homes. And that's sort of unequivocal. But if you read Tosebro's analysis of what's happened in the Scandinavian countries, he suggests that actually what's been achieved is little more than people having better living conditions. So people have moved to better, smaller living conditions, but he argues that not much else has changed for most people with intellectual disabilities. And some of what he says resonates very strongly with what the research says about the situation, particularly in Australia and in the UK. So it suggests that people with intellectual disabilities are present in the community, but they're not participating and they're certainly not included in communities in any large way, that people live in a distinct social space and they have social networks made up of staff, family members, and other people with intellectual disabilities, that they have high rates of loneliness, high rates of abuse, higher mortality rates compared to the rest of the population, and high rates of avoidable deaths, and that they have restrictions on their exercise of choice and control. And interestingly, the data is beginning to show that in Australia, even despite all of our changes, the rates of guardianship for people with intellectual disabilities are increasing and are actually lasting longer than they may have done in the past. All of these indicators are very reliant on small-scale qualitative studies of people with intellectual disabilities or on larger-scale surveys. And larger-scale surveys often don't differentiate subgroups of people with disabilities, so it's hard to pin down who they're actually talking about sometimes. But what we do know is that large-scale surveys and quality of life surveys are often completed by proxy respondents for people with intellectual disabilities. So most of the quality of life tools rely on proxy respondents for people who have anything more than a mild intellectual disability. So it's really hard to capture what the quality of life actually looks like for people with intellectual disabilities in the community. There's very little comparative data across countries, and we often talk across purposes about different groups and use different definitions. But I would argue, and Jim Mansell argued before me, that engagement is a really good indicator of quality of life. So engagement of a person in meaningful activities and social relationships in their home and in the community is a good indicator of the rest of somebody's quality of life. If you're not engaged, then it's going to be very hard to have social relationships, to be included, to be healthy, and so on. So engagement is a really useful indicator, and we've got really good comparative data over time, which allows you to sort of look back about progress with that as an indicator of quality of life. In 1994, Emerson and Hatton did a huge piece of work that brought together all of the research that had been done in various countries around small group homes and institutions about the level of engagement of people in different places. And they consolidated it all into this diagram and these figures that you can see below. And this data showed unequivocally that the average level of engagement for people who lived in small group homes that they called staff housing was higher on average than engagement for people in small institutions or in large institutions. But if you look carefully at this, what this also says is that there's an enormous range of engagement. So there's an overlap then between the range of engagement of people in group homes with the range of engagement in large institutions. So a good group home will have a much better average level of engagement. But a good institution may offer, for some people, a higher level of engagement than a bad group home. So there's this overlap between the different models of services. And since then, our group and Julie Beadle-Brown and Jim Mansell have been tracking data about people's level of engagement in small group homes. And you can see that this is the Emerson and Hatton 1996-94 figures, where the average engagement was 47.7. Mansell demonstrated in 2008 that the average level of engagement in good services could be 77% of people's time. Julie Beadle-Brown showed for people with very high support needs, an average level of engagement could be 53% in small group homes for people with very high support needs. This other data is our Australian data, where we managed to show that an average level of engagement could be 65% for people, and that was in 2017, and it dropped to 55% in 2024. And you can see that the average level of engagement for people with higher support needs followed the same trajectory. We managed to make it go up, or the organisations managed to make it go up, and then it's dropped off again. But if you look at this data, I think the most important thing is that even in the better services for people with high support needs, which is this one here, which is in 2021, Julie's data, and our data in 2017, people with high support needs are still disengaged for almost half of their time. That means people are sitting doing nothing for almost half of the time that they're awake. And that's an indicator of a relatively poor quality of life for those people. So in terms of general progress, where have we got to? And I think to sum it up, I would suggest that the progress has been variable over time and that we've taken some steps backwards. So some groups have fared consistently worse than other groups. So people with severe intellectual disabilities or more complex support needs have, as you can see, have had lower levels of engagement. They've also had lower levels of quality of support. They've also been subject to many more restrictive practices than people with lower support needs. We've also seen more recently the people who are living in small group homes who don't have social capital being left behind, and that was a sort of major conclusion of the NDIS review, that there's been other alternatives being offered to people who do have social capital, who can exercise choice and control with the right support. But there's a group of people that have been left behind, and they've fared worse than the people who do have really good advocacy. We're also seeing, and this is both in Australia and in Sweden, more positive outcomes for people with mild intellectual disabilities, who are actually taking up roles in the society which come from them being excluded. So they're taking up self-advocacy roles, they're forming self-advocacy organisations, being employed in self-advocacy, they're being employed in co-design, they're being employed and included in inclusive research, and lots of other sort of new activities where people are being included, but they're predominantly people with mild intellectual disability that are benefiting from that significant change. In Sweden, interestingly, a longitudinal study that Ub Carson has done showed that there's less community participation amongst people with milder or more severe intellectual disabilities in 2021 than there was in 2001. So they've gone backwards in terms of their levels of community participation. What the data shows in Australia is that there's significant variability between small group homes. Some are doing really well, some are not doing really well in terms of the quality of support they're providing and people's quality of life. Most of the research that has been done around alternatives to small group homes shows that supported living, which takes different forms, but is less shared support, less 24-hour support, tends to have fairly mediocre outcomes. And their outcomes are fairly similar to group homes. And where there is any difference, there's more choice and control in those sorts of supported living settings, but there are high levels of social isolation and loneliness. So despite the huge investment that we've had in Australia in disability services and the shift to an individualised funding system of the NDIS, our data is showing that there is a significant decline in people's levels of engagement and the quality of support that they're receiving in small group homes since 2017. So we were on an upward trajectory from 2013, we got to 2017, 2018, and then it's declined. So we're going backwards in many ways. We've also declined on some of the other indicators, and this is still work in progress, but it seems to be clear that the proportion of people with intellectual disabilities who have friends or who have regular contact with families or who participate in the community may have gone backwards since 2013 too. And we're also seeing very clearly in quite a lot of the research about the NDIS, the unequal benefits for people that come from individualised funding, which are particularly associated with whether people have got good advocates, strong family members to benefit from that individualised funding. So the question then is, why has there been such limited progress? And people often jump to the conclusion that it's because of the problems with small group homes. And they consider that there were problems from the outset with the design of small group homes, that they've replicated the institutional practices and culture that was in the large institutions. And you can see that quote, which suggests, and this comes from a European book, that the progress was slow and the original institutional practices were just replicated in community settings. And the literature is full of comments about unskilled minding, about care being just simply maintaining people, and staff taking care of people and taking care of the home, rather than having a more active role in supporting people to live a good quality of life. And as a result of that, many people, and our data shows that too, who live in small group homes are disengaged, are bored, and are socially isolated. But not all of them. And the Royal Commission came to the conclusion in 2023 that this model of small group homes, which has been the dominant model since we closed the institutions, is actually really flawed, and we should be closing group homes and looking at other alternatives. And so back in 2006, Jim Mansell said, well, is it the model that's flawed, or is it the implementation? And I think what I want to argue is it's the neglect that we've had in small group homes of the quality of practice within them. We've focused too much on size and place, and not enough on what happens in those places. And back in the 1980s, when the first demonstration projects were carried out in the UK, Mansell and Fels and Emerson drew attention to the significance of staff practice, and they demonstrated that it was possible to shift from a care minding type of environment to individualised support and to avoid institutional culture in small group homes. If you read their early research, it's full of how you should be able to provide and how you can provide good quality support for people in small group homes. And we did a realist review in 2018, which asked the question, what makes most difference then to the quality of life of people in group homes? And we looked at the evidence across all of these different types of propositions that were made about what made most difference. And the thing that jumped out that had the strongest amount of evidence was staff and frontline managerial working practices. If staff were using active support And if frontline practice leadership was in place, those were the two things that made most difference, together with specialist support that compensated for specific differences that people might have in terms of behaviour support, ageing, or other things like sensory impairments. We also found that there were necessary but not sufficient things, which were about size, resources, and design. There was some evidence about the significance of organisational policies and processes. There was some growing evidence about staff culture, and there was very little about the external environment. Things have changed since then, and I'll come to that. But what was clear from that realist review was that active support was a key practice which made the most significant difference to what was happening for people's quality of life in group homes. And active support, as many of you know, evolved from the UK early demonstration programs. And the work that our group have been doing recently has been analysing the dimensions of active support, and it's actually two rather than one dimension. It's a set of technical skills about supporting people to be engaged in activities, but it's also a set of interpersonal skills about supporting people to interact, either with staff or with each other or with members of the community or family or friends. And both of those dimensions are predicated on staff knowing the person. It's clear that active support is the foundation for more specialist support, as I said at the beginning, and Jim Mansell said that in 1993, and it really hasn't changed since then. And it's becoming clear from the UK work that good support doesn't cost any more than poor support. And that's work that Julie Beadle-Brown's been involved in over quite a long period of time, where it's not the number of staff, it's the skills that staff have that make the difference. So despite the enormous amount of evidence about practice and what good practice looks like, practice has been neglected in service systems, particularly in the Australian and the Swedish service system, where we have sort of most knowledge about practice. In the UK, staff training at the front line is almost non-existent. There's no mandated training for staff, for direct support staff. In Australia and in Sweden, there are untrained frontline staff. There's no mandatory qualifications, and people are left with often vague, unspecific and sort of de-differentiated practice expectations that are pitched at a high level. You know, you should respect people, you must respect their rights, you must help people to exercise their rights. It's that level of rhetoric about what practice should be, rather than defining the specific practices that we expect to see in relation to supporting people with intellectual disabilities and having qualifications around those things. So what we see from both the UK data and from the Australian data is that the quality of support and practice within services can be good. So in 2008, Mansell showed the average overall quality of active support was very close to being good, with 65%. Julie Beadle-Brown showed in 2021 that the average level of quality of active support for people in her relatively small study of people with high support needs could also be good. So good support is possible for people with high support needs. But then if you look at these other figures, these from Australia in 2013, the quality of active support was 48%. It was nowhere near the average of being good. By 2017, it had got to 59%, so it was on this upward trajectory for people with high support needs. But by 2024, it's dropped off again. So good support is possible for people in small group homes, but for some reason, we haven't focused our attention on it, and we haven't been able to sustain it. So why is there this neglect of practice? And I think that the easiest answer to that is that it's difficult. It's difficult to organise practice, and it's difficult to sustain good practice. And it's very clear that staff training isn't enough. It's not enough just to train staff. That training needs to be embedded in a bigger competency framework. And we've been developing evidence over the last 15 years about the conditions that are needed to embed good active support and good practice in organisations. And I think we're now much clearer about some of those predictors. And they exist at the organisational level, the organisational leadership, around valuing practice and creating and reinforcing the value of practice, creating sustainable structures and processes for frontline practice leadership and for training and for practice within the organisation. At the frontline practice leadership level, it's having skilled frontline practice leaders who are skilled in practice but also skilled as practice leaders, of knowing the people that are being supported and knowing the staff, and having time as a frontline practice leader, as a frontline manager, to carry out the tasks of frontline practice leadership. And at the actual service level, it's about having staff that are trained and are confident with their management and are getting support from management. It's the cultural dimension of supporting well-being that is a major predictor, and it's size, having 6 or less people and thinking about the mix of people that you have in a home. But I think there's some other reasons why practice has been neglected, not just because it's difficult. I think it's because of the context now in which small group homes have developed and in which our disability support system is now developing and being influenced by this wider welfare reform context. So it's very clear, if you contrast Sweden and Australia, that it's not necessarily the amount of resources that go into a disability support system, but it's how those resources are used. So the outcomes for people in Sweden, the outcomes for people in Australia are fairly similar, as I've tried to show. But interestingly, in Sweden, there's been almost no investment in disability services. Their investment sort of stagnated after the initial development of small group homes. Whereas in Australia, we've had this exponential growth of resources going into the welfare, into the disability support system. But what's common to both systems, and what was foreshadowed by Jim Mansell in 2006, is the negative impact of neoliberalism, which is now defining the context of disability support services and disability policy. And that context, I would argue, is drawing attention away from skilled frontline practice. It's diverting our attention from practice being important. And it's, I could talk about this for a long time, but I think just some of the highlights are that marketisation has focused on choice and control. It's focused on people being consumers. It's taken a very anti-professional stance, which sees each person as an individual, as a consumer, who can direct and find their own support. You don't need skilled professionals when you can self-direct support. So that's taken the emphasis away from training and skills towards choice and control and self-direction of people. The regulations that are required in a market system have set minimum standards. And so the focus has been on compliance and reporting around minimum standards rather than on the quality of support. And the regulation has created a huge administrative burden, both in terms of transactions of managing a market system, but also in terms of regulation. And we've seen this divert attention from practice and leadership and training at the front line, because the resources are being taken up with reporting and compliance. And there's some really strong evidence around that in our publication last year about why frontline practice leadership is going backwards. And part of marketisation is also de-differentiation. And it's very clear in our system, and it's also very clear in the Norwegian and the other Scandinavian systems, where generic service systems have been built, where services are developed for diverse groups of people with disabilities, and where people with intellectual disabilities are just not identified as a specific group with specific needs. They're just an individual, or they're part of this larger group of people with disabilities. And that means that services are developed for everybody with a disability, that there's no specialist knowledge at the managerial or even the frontline levels around the particular type of support that people with intellectual disabilities need in order to flourish, in order to be engaged. And that is repeated in the rights perspective, where the focus is on the social model and concern with removing barriers to participation, which neglects the impact of people's impairment on their participation. It neglects the fact that some people have such high levels of intellectual impairment that they need intensive support in order to be engaged. And they will need that whether there are social barriers there or not. But it diverts attention away from that individual practice onto broader social conditions. And the idea of the individualisation of support, which is dominant in our market model now, also relies on individual direction, but it relies on people having social capital, people with intellectual disabilities having social capital to help direct and organise that support. And that's very clear with some of the services, for one, which have been developed by families, some of the really good individualised services that have happened, but they're taking families 24 hours a day to manage and organise that support. And most people don't have that type of resource to do that support and that organisation of their support. So I think if you look at the overarching picture, I use the term failed ambitions, which was the part of the title of the book of the Q history that we wrote a couple of years ago that David Henderson led. But I think we failed in many ways on our ambitions about deinstitutionalisation. And that raises a whole heap of questions about where we're going to and what's next. It's really clear that practice and culture and what happens every day are very significant, irrespective of the place that you're in or how many other people there are or the size of the place. We need, I think, much more empirical evidence about how to support people with high support needs. What type of places, what size of places, and what practice will really support that group to have a better quality of life, because that's the group that we've probably failed most and who we hear about least. And it raises for me the question of, is small size still necessary and sufficient? So we argued in 2018 that small size was a necessary but not sufficient condition for a good quality of life. But you have to ask, why is it that size has stalled in so much of Europe? Places like Belgium and the Netherlands that still have large institutions. And we're beginning to see some arguments in the literature which say, well, some of these larger places can have good outcomes because they have skilled and specialist staff. There's an argument that if you have really skilled staff and you have large-scale institutions that don't look anything like the old institutions but are still more people on one site, then people can have a good quality of life. That's what's being argued. There's very little evidence about the outcomes of those larger institutions. And one has to ask, what's the cost for the people that don't live in those larger institutions of the perception that that's where people with more severe disabilities belong, in these nice larger institutions. And I was really quite astonished at the defence of those large institutions that there is in many parts of Europe. But then, do individualised options, more smaller than group homes, have possibilities? Are they possible for people who don't have social capital? And we really don't have hardly any evidence about outcomes for people in more individualised options and whether they can be scaled up and whether they can be implemented for people without strong family support. So I think there's a whole set of new questions that we need to think about in terms of where we're going forward. When I say to people in Europe, the aim is to close group homes in Australia, they sort of say, why do you want to do that? We're trying to close the institutions and have smaller group homes, whereas in Australia, we're trying to close group homes and go to smaller individualised living. Are we going in the right direction? Or does size and place matter that much? Is it what actually happens in those places that's more important? Or is it a combination? I think just finally, we need to think about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve for people with intellectual disabilities, and particularly for people with more severe and profound intellectual disabilities. Are these normative outcomes of having a job, being autonomous, being independent, are they really the type of outcomes that are ever going to be achieved for people with more severe and profound intellectual disabilities? Or should we be doing, as is being argued by some of the academics and practitioners, that having relationships, belonging to a community, being known, being recognised and valued for who you are, that those are the most important outcomes we should be thinking about. And I think we need to, at all levels in our service system, begin to challenge de-differentiation. It may be counter to the current debates, but I think we need to emphasise the difference of people with intellectual disabilities from other people with disabilities. We need to emphasise their need for skilled support, because they're the group of people that have been most disadvantaged by markets and by deprofessionalisation. And we can talk about people's differences without devaluing them. In the past, we might not have done that, but I think this is a challenge to draw out people's differences without devaluing, but recognising them and using those differences to provide the right type of support. I think part of what we need to be able to do is to hold competing perspectives. We need to have both and thinking rather than either or thinking. So we need to think about social structures and the social model and removing social obstacles, but we also need to think about people's levels of impairment and the support that people need. People with intellectual disabilities undoubtedly have a similar humanity to other people with disabilities and to the rest of the population, but they need different approaches and different practices to respecting that and enabling those people to have a good life. So I'm going to stop there and hope that's generated some thoughts and some questions.
Thanks, Chris. That was wonderful. I was enthralled. Thank you very much for that. Obviously, you've done a lot of work in this area and been very prolific. So that was good to see you put it all together into that presentation. Now, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A. So if you have any questions for Chris, if you could pop them in the question and answer box, then I will be able to ask Chris her perspectives on those questions. Chris, I'm going to start with one question here. There's a question about how you define social capital. So I think you explained part of that, but I'm just wondering if in this context you might be able to unpack how you see social capital for people with intellectual disability in accessing services.
So I use this word social capital very loosely, but it really refers to if you think about the analogy with intellectual capital, sort of how smart you are, how you can manage systems, social capital is those people that you've got around you that are going to help you navigate and argue for what it is that's important to you if you can't argue for those things yourselves. So it's predominantly families, advocates, friends, and we know that in general, people with intellectual disabilities, particularly those who've lived in group homes for a long time, often have very, very few social people in their social network and have limited social capital. But we also know that there's some people that have very, very strong families and lots of social capital. So it's that sort of difference between having people in your side that can actually spend a lot of time and energy advocating for you and getting what you need. So I think that's the best I can do.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. Thank you. There's a question here. Well, there's a couple of people affirming your summary of the situation and what might need to happen and the questions that you've posed. But the next question is, do you think that the failure to adopt evidence-based practice has contributed to the poor outcomes for people living in group homes?
Yes, Coral, absolutely. um, I think we're getting closer to a recognition that evidence-based practice is fundamental to quality outcomes for people in group homes. But up until very recently, there's been no directions about the use of evidence-based practice. We seem to have thought that evidence-based practice is something that professionals do. OTs and speech therapists and physios, that's evidence-based practice, and that the everyday support that frontline workers do is just support. And so we've never really paid attention in our policies to defining it and to mandating it. And I'm hoping that that's sort of in the process of changing with the work that's happening about the new standards for supported independent living services. But we'll see how that turns out. So yeah, I mean, and the other thing I think is it's not only mandating evidence-based practice in terms of active support, but it's mandating the conditions that you need to have to make that practice happen and keep happening. So professionals are often self-governing, they get their own supervision, they are part of professional bodies, whereas support workers need to have really strong frontline practice leadership. And I think they need to have sort of registered managers almost that have mandated qualifications to lead their practice, so that we've guaranteed supervision and leadership in place for that evidence-based practice, because it won't happen on its own.
Okay. Thanks for that, Chris. There's a question here about what outcomes do you think we should be focusing on? So I think this might be in relation to one of your final points about whether the outcomes of securing a job and the social sort of standards that we have, is that appropriate for people with more severe intellectual disabilities? I think this question is in relation to that point. What outcomes do you think we should be focusing on, and can you tell us your thinking behind that?
So I think we should, if we take the concept of quality of life, then there's 8 domains in quality of life, and I think we should be focusing on all of those domains. So does the person have relationships with other people? Does the person have good health? Is the person experiencing emotional well-being? Is the person included in some shape or form in the wider community? Are they contributing? And so I think we need to think about the outcomes in relation to each person, but the overarching quality of life gives you that framework that you can then work within, rather than saying an outcome is paid employment, an outcome is autonomy and self-determination, because those things, as parents of people with severe and profound intellectual disabilities will tell you, are just not on the radar for somebody with a profound disability. And so we need to recognise that and stop pretending as if people with more severe and profound disabilities are just like everybody else and have the same aims. And I think we're seeing that in society as a whole, that actually people are beginning to question this sort of normalised life. And young people and old people today want to go off and do different things. So I think we need to have a broader idea of what outcomes will be, and the quality of life is a good framework.
Great, thanks, Chris. There's a question here about why is it that you think that disability advocates aren't advocating on behalf of the people with intellectual disability about their diminishing quality of life? Is part of the explanation is the domination of human rights ideology, is what this person suggests, and how do we influence advocates in their thinking?
That's a huge question.
It is a lot.
Well knows. I think the problem is it goes back to de-differentiation, and I think it goes back to the rights perspective. The rights perspective, if you read it carefully, shies away from recognising individual groups of people with disabilities, shies away from recognising impairment, because its focus is on changing social conditions. And the social model has traditionally not focused on individualised support, but a critical realist approach to disability combines those two things about changing social conditions and getting support that's relevant to people's impairment. And I don't think we've matured sufficiently to hold those two perspectives at the same time. And I think we have, it's very hard to represent. So we've moved to saying lived experience is really important, and lived experience of an individual's own type of disability, their own experiences, is fundamental to understanding what's important for that person. But it's very hard then to generalize from the lived experience of one person to what that means for a whole heap of other people that might have had different lived experiences and different impairments. But I think what we're seeing is the dominance of advocacy of particular groups of people with lived experience, often with physical and sensory disabilities, who are very articulate and are trying to push things in a particular direction, but aren't necessarily having any lived experience or knowledge of people with more severe and profound intellectual disabilities. And in an ideal world, we would have people with intellectual disabilities, people with severe and profound disabilities, being really strong, loud advocates for themselves, but they're not, because that's not part of their skill set. And so we don't have, until very recently, we haven't had really strong peak bodies representing the views and the perspectives of people with intellectual disabilities. And I think that's a real challenge. And, you know, they need the intellectual disability advocates need the power of the mainstream advocates to bring them along. If it hadn't been for the mainstream advocates, we wouldn't have had the NDIS. But the result was the NDIS wasn't well designed for people with intellectual disabilities, because we didn't want to rock the boat. We wanted it to happen, but it didn't take into account their individual differences. So it's a real challenge of holding what's similar and what's different. And I think educating the mainstream advocates about the need to differentiate and why that's important, and not necessarily disempowering. I think that's one of the sort of biggest challenges that we really have in the next few years.
I think that was a great answer from my perspective. Thank you, Chris. That was a big question. If some of the next questions are related to the lack of focus on practice, or the practice within small homes, does I'm going to say, what impact do you think could be attributed to the high staff turnover of disability support workers?
So the high staff,
yeah,
the high staff turnover is something that is obviously relatively new in the last few years, and I'm sure to some extent it contributes to the dropping in quality that we're seeing, because it's in order to support somebody well, you need to know them. And you can learn so much at the beginning of a shift, but that's not really enough to provide good support. So long-term relationships and the quality of relationships between staff and people are fundamentally important. But the turnover is also creating an enormous impost on organisations, because they're having to train people, they're having to orient people, they're having to onboard them, and that sort of churn costs is contributing to their high rates of deficits at the moment. So it's having a minus in both directions, I think. And I think this was foreshadowed as a problem when the NDIS was developed by the Productivity Commission, and there were lots of little projects about workforce, and nothing seemed to, we haven't solved that problem yet, but it is a major issue, I think.
Yeah. Just while you were answering that, there was another comment from one of the attendees about a recent Harvard study that found the quality of relationships were the strongest predictors of long-term happiness and health rather than wealth or social status, and that you mentioned that knowing a person is a key factor in active support, which relies on a stable workforce. How do we support the disability workforce to stay in their jobs and take pride in their very important roles? Which is related to another question, which is about that working in group homes has historically not been seen as a valued profession, which may contribute to the lack of education and professional practice. Do you have any comments on those?
I'm sure you can foreshadow that. I mean, if we are serious about achieving a good quality of life for people with intellectual disabilities, then we need to be serious about training staff, respecting staff, paying staff, giving them status, and making it an attractive attractive occupation for people. People go into it with very high expectations and are incredibly disappointed, I think, in the type of training and support that they get in that role and in the levels of pay. So I think we have to value workers more. Now, the interesting thing that relates to the other question is when I talked to the people in the Netherlands, they said we can't afford to have small group homes because the cost of staff is so high. So they have 3-year trained staff, support workers who are trained for 3 years as social pedagogues in a university who are providing support to people on a day-to-day basis that are equivalent to our support workers. So, and then they have all these other specialists. They have, qualified frontline leaders. They have specialists, all the health professionals that are part of the team. And we just don't have that. So we're not giving people status and recognition and training, and we're also not giving people the backup support that they need. And we've designed a system that has very high expectations of outcomes, but we haven't focused on how we're going to achieve those because we've just been obsessed with place and size, I think.
So I'm going to interpret a couple of the questions here to ask you, how do you think we can change that? And what is it? So one of the questions is, why do you think that, given your research and given the evidence, why do you think there's not suitable funding for organisations to appropriately train their staff in active support and frontline practice leadership? But I'm going to ask you, what do you think needs to happen next so that we can move towards a more training and support model?
So I think it's beginning to happen. The larger organisations and their larger service providers are beginning to have those conversations. We're beginning to see some of them go under to say we can't do this anymore on the amount of funding that's coming. And I think they're beginning to question too the very fragmented model that we have. And I think the new standards are beginning to say things about there needs to be training of these types of things. And the recent court cases around the deaths of people suggests there also needs to be competency. So it's not only being trained in active support, it's being competent in active support. Not only being trained in supported decision making, but being competent in that. So if we start to put in place standards, this is what we expect of organisations, then you would hope that the funding body, which is the NDIS, will match that with funding in order to enable organisations to do that. And I think as we get clearer about the organisation components that are necessary to have in place, then we'll be clear about the type of amounts of funding that are needed. I think at the moment we are wasting a huge amount of funding in churn and in transactional costs and in reporting a whole heap of stuff. So I think we could do it with the existing. It's just about how you use it. Yeah, but I think too that it's also about differentiating people with intellectual disabilities and their support needs, which aren't the same as other groups of people. So if we just keep treating everybody as the same, and the sort of counterpoint is, well, we don't need trained staff because people should be able to self-direct, people should be designing their own services, then we're not going to get anywhere. So I think we need to almost agree this is a different group of people from people without cognitive disabilities, and start to proceed down that line. Yeah. It's complicated.
Yeah. We might just have one more question. From your experience, what are the key changes we can make in our daily practices and staff approaches to ensure people living in group homes experience genuine choice, inclusion, and a meaningful life, not just good care?
I don't know. It depends where you're starting from.
True.
I think it depends who you are in an organisation and the practice that's already happening. But I think, every staff member coming on shift needs to really have a strong sense of what is their role on that shift and how are they going to support the people that they're charged with supporting and give them their full attention to supporting them to be engaged in activities that they choose to do, in social interactions, in building connections in the community, in making choices, and to see our role is to support people. Our role isn't just to mind people, and to be, reminded and have that reinforced at the beginning of every shift, so that we can shift away from people just coming and minding people, spending time on their phones, ignoring people, and just trying to have an easy shift. And as long as there's nothing, nothing untoward happens, then we're all fine. So it's a mindset, I think, of every staff member and of every manager and of every organisation.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I think we've answered most of the questions there. Oh, there's a few more popping in. Do you think we need to differentiate people with intellectual disability from people with cognitive impairment? I think you've just mentioned that. What level of differentiation do you think is required?
So the work that I've done with Jacinta Douglas, whose expertise is around people with acquired brain injury, shows very clearly that there are some things that they have in common because they both have cognitive impairments, people with intellectual disabilities and people with acquired brain injury, but there are quite significant differences between those two groups of people. And obviously each individual is an individual, but as a group, people with acquired brain injuries are often very able to talk about their own support needs, to talk about their own histories, their own social connections, whereas when you ask somebody with an intellectual disability to talk about their life, they struggle to do that in any sort of fluent way. So there are significant differences. They're not all the same. And intellectual disabilities, we know, is often associated with other particular syndromes and is a global delay in development, whereas acquired brain injury affects different parts of the brain. It doesn't have a global impact on people's brains. So they're different. And again, they're different from people with autism, who often don't have any cognitive impairment, and so they're different groups of people. So I think there's something to be said for talking about the commonalities that people with disabilities have, the commonalities about negative attitudes about social barriers. But when you get beneath that generality, you need to say, well, the social barriers that people with intellectual disabilities experience are quite different from the social barriers that people with acquired brain injury might experience, or that people with a physical disability might experience. So that's when differentiation is important. It's the interaction between the nature of somebody's impairment and their context that you need to work out. How is that context impacting on that person with that particular impairment? And it's really interesting that we never say, oh, we don't need training for guide dogs, we don't need training for Braille, and yet those are very specialist things around people's impairments. But how often do we hear people say, you need specialist training for support workers who are working with people with intellectual disabilities? That's sort of not part of the lexicon.
Yep. I think that relates to this next question I'm going to ask you, which is looking at this through the lens of de-differentiation. Larger homes with better qualified staff seems like it could have more desirable outcomes for individuals' living arrangements with poor support. This seems at odds with the increasingly individualised funding model we have here in Australia. Have we gone too far down this track to go back? I'm going to add my question to that, which is it possible that we need a diversity of size and place options of homes, and that the focus should more be on the culture and support that's provided, individualised within those? Do you have a comment on this? Have we gone too far down the track of group homes?
So I don't think we've gone too far down the track of group homes. I think small group living is really clearly better than on your own living for some people, and it's better than large scale living from the traditional old institutions. Like, we have the data about that, but there's also data about cluster housing, about intentional communities where people do live in larger settings, some of the large communities in the UK. And there isn't good data about the outcomes for people in the Netherlands institutions. So I think that's what I'm trying to do, is to ask, well, we should stop thinking about an orthodoxy about individualized is best, and start to think about what are the outcomes and how do we achieve them with practice. And then once you're supporting somebody really well, trying different types of living options for them. At the moment, people haven't had any choices in the past and haven't had the experience of different living situations to say, I prefer this to that. You can't do that in a sort of abstract way. But I think there's a danger to large institutions, because when you start to read what they're writing about those places, is that it sounds like some people belong in large separate places, and that then becomes dangerous, because then there's a danger that escalates into those people then get neglected. And if you read the history of Kew cottages, that started with really good intentions and they were never sort of fulfilled. So making people physically separate and distinct, and carving them out as a group that can't live in other places, I think is really dangerous. But having a range of options that people can make meaningful choices about, and that means being supported to make those choices and being able to experience those different living options. I think that's where we need to go. We need to experiment with different things, but stop just talking about size and place, and talk about size and place and practice as well, because it always drops off for some reason.
Great.
Does that answer your question?
It answers my question. I hope it answers Melanie's as well. All right, I think we might have answered most of those questions there. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Chris, again for providing such a really good insight into the work that you've done over the last, I'll say 20 years. So thank you very much, and thank you all for attending.